Welcome to Bunnyfish Crafts. I'm your host Heather, known as Bunnyfish on Instagram, YouTube, and Patreon. And today I am here to bring you a special bonus episode. So I'm really excited about this episode. It is So You Want to Make a Scrappy Blanket. 9 questions to ask before you start your Scrappy Blanket. This video is for anybody. Maybe you've never made a Scrappy Blanket before and you would like to. Maybe you've made Scrappy Blankets before and you were at varying levels of success. I think that these questions are pretty important to ask yourself before you commit to something super long term like a Scrappy Blanket. As I am talking to you, I am going to be knitting on my current Scrappy Blanket project. Isn't that beautiful? I'm so excited. So that's where I'm looking if I look down. And I'm gonna have to do that when I turn the blanket, sorry. So anyway, let's get started. Question 1, who is the blanket for? Determining this question will determine a lot of things about the blanket. It will determine the main use for the blanket. So if you're making for a baby versus an adult, that will make lots of changes to how the blanket might be used. A throw blanket has different needs than a sleeping blanket. Not hugely different, but slightly different needs. And that will also determine if everything you put in your Scrappy Blanket has to be machine washable. For this blanket that I'm working on right now, my answer for question 1 was that the blanket was for me, and that determined, and I determined that for that I wanted to use my favorite color, which is green, but I didn't want to limit myself to just green yarns because then it might be a hard time. So my rule, based on wanting to use green as my main thought process, was that I could use yarns that had blue or green in them somewhere. So there's no solid brown squares in here, no solid black squares, but as you can see, lots of different colors. But they're all tied together with blue and green. Question 2, what size will you make? So once you have your question 1, question 2 kind of goes hand in hand. You're not going to make the same size blanket for a baby as you are for a college student. I mean, I suppose you could, but I don't feel like it'll meet the needs of each of those people the same way. So that's a pretty important consideration too, and I will link below this chart that I'm going to put up really quick that shows like standard comforter sizes. I use that chart all the time when I am planning blanket projects. And of course, make your blanket your own. Just because those are standard sizes don't mean that that's what you have to make. As you can see, none of those sizes on there are square, but if what you want to make is a square Scrappy Blanket, go right ahead. You're the boss of your knitting, but it is something to keep in mind. Because if you're making something, for instance, for your kiddo to take away to college, you might want to consider what size a college dorm room bed is. Maybe. Or not. Knowing the standard sizes can help you bend the rules. Question 3, do you have a deadline? This is, again, I mean, all of the questions are important, so I'm going to try to stop saying this is pretty important, but if you are making, if you need to make a blanket and you decide to do a Scrappy Blanket and you need it done in a month, that could change what you decide to go with versus if you're just going to finish it whenever it gets finished. Did I tell you all that I'm at the yarn shop? This is not in my house. This is at the yarn shop that I work at. Yeah, it would be lovely if all of this yarn lived in my house, but it doesn't. So I just pet it twice a week. Anyway, if you have a deadline, you may need to set goals for yourself to meet that deadline. Like how much work do you need to do a day or a week to finish your project by the deadline? And the answers to these questions are not set in stone. So when I started this blanket, I didn't have a deadline, but now I want it finished by the end of the month. So I know how many garter ridges I need to knit a day in order to make it to that deadline. And my deadline is arbitrary because this blanket is for me, so I can change my mind later. If I don't finish it this month, I can finish it whenever. Last year, I thought I was going to finish it in 2021, and it's 2022. So yeah, that goal left. But if you do have a deadline, figure out what you need to do to stick to that deadline. And also, especially if you're making a very large fingering weight or lace weight or very thin yarn, very large blanket, plan yourself some breaks. You're probably going to have fatigue. I know that on blankets where it's big like this is now a full blanket. I know I would not carry this around to work on it in summer, but when I started it, I started by making little panels. So this panel is 5 by 5 squares, so that was perfect to take around in summertime to work on. So keep that in mind if you're going to need to plan breaks in your projected time frame for your blanket. Question 4, what type of look are you interested in for your Scrappy blanket? I now have a chair here for my blanket because it was falling off of my lap as I was trying to work on it. Rude. So for Scrappy blankets, you can do all sorts of things. You can do something that's super scrappy, or you can do something like this that has like a color idea but is still pretty scrappy. You could do color blocks, you could do fading. So what do you like the look of? Another consideration is, do you like the look of knit Scrappy blankets or the look of crochet Scrappy blankets, or both? Or maybe like woven Scrappy blankets. I don't know how that would work because I don't make weaving stuff. I don't weave, there we go. I don't make woven stuff. I don't weave, so, but I'm sure you could make a blanket. I feel like I watched a podcast where they did that a few years ago. Do you like blankets that are like stripes across, like a granny stripe blanket, or like some sort of marled blanket where it's just long strips? Do you like the look of little small pieces? A great way to figure out what you like is to look at other people's projects. So if you're able to access Ravelry, you could look around on Ravelry for Scrappy blankets. You can look on Scrappy Sunday. The hashtag Scrappy Sunday on Instagram is a really, really great way to fall down Scrappy blanket rabbit hole. So you can get lots and lots of ideas. 2 ideas that I have coming up for things that I have not done before in a Scrappy blanket. I've made lots of them. In case you're new here, I have 10 on the needles right now, needles and hooks. I had 11 at the beginning of the year, but I finished my first one and I am rapidly closing in on finishing my second of this year. So I have a lot of experience making Scrappy blankets. But 2 that I would like to make at some point is someone, I don't know who, I don't know when I saw it, but they made a mitered square blanket. And I'm sure several people have done this, but the first row where you pick up the stitches to make your miter, they did it in black. So every square has a little black border. I love the look of that. It looks like little pieces of mosaic or stained glass or something, and it's just so beautiful. And I wouldn't necessarily need to use black depending on who I was making the blanket for. I could use a different color. Maybe if I made myself a blanket again, I wouldn't make the requirement that all of the yarn have green or blue in it, but maybe I'd pick a couple colors of green that I could outline the squares in. Who knows? There's also a tessellating fish blanket that I think is so cool. I think it would be so fiddly, which is why even though it's been on my radar for a long time, I haven't made it. I think it's really cool and something I would possibly consider in the future because tessellations are awesome. Question number 5. What is a deal breaker for a project for you? This question, this is a very important question. They're all important questions, but this one especially, if you know something is a deal breaker for you on a small project, don't pick a scrappy blanket that uses that technique or that whatever, because scrappy blankets take time and they're a lot of work, and you should enjoy the work instead of hating what you're doing. So if you don't enjoy seaming, don't pick a blanket that you need to seam on. If you want it to be portable, something with small pieces that you seam up later might be a better option, or something that has like I'm making, for instance, a blanket that has crocheted flowers and then they're being joined. So you make these flowers and then you do 2 rounds after that, and on the second round for the outer part, that's where you join as you go. So I can make a whole bunch of those flowers while I'm out and about, and then I can leave the larger project, which is not very large yet, but one day it will be. I can leave the larger project at home and just attach the flower motifs at home. So those are things to consider. If you think that having to piece small pieces together sounds dreadful, then probably don't do that. There are so many pattern options for scrappy blankets that you can just not do a pattern that you don't like. Number 6, where will you source your yarn? Are you going to only use leftovers? Are you only using your leftovers? Are you getting leftovers from friends? Do you plan to do swaps? Are you going to purchase any of the scraps? Let me just tell you that going down the purchasing minis rabbit hole can get a little spendy, but it can also be a nice way to get something new into your stash without having to commit to a whole skein of something. I really love mini skeins at yarn festivals because I can get something from a dyer and support them in a small way and then not have to commit to a whole project. Or the other thing is, sometimes I really like the way a color looks, but I would not wear it. Like this color right here, so super pretty. I would not wear this color, but I could pick up a mini and put it into a blanket or a couple blankets, and that can fulfill the want to support a dyer or a yarn shop and give you that little dopamine hit from making a purchase of yarn without committing you to a full skein of something. However, I've made scrappy blankets where all of the yarns were leftovers from my projects or other people's projects, and that is also so lovely. It's nice because then you get to revisit the yarns and think, oh, I made this with that yarn. Let's see if I can find one for you really quick. This square right here is 2 yarns that I striped, and I made a sample for a friend of mine for their yarn. So I got to keep the leftovers, and of course I made a square in my blanket. Question 7, when will you work on the blanket? If you have a deadline, this one kind of goes hand in hand with that, but even if you don't have a deadline, this is something to consider before you start the blanket, especially if you don't have answers for some of the previous questions. Some ideas of when you might decide you want to work on a scrappy blanket is after a project. So you finish a project and then you immediately put your yarn into your scrappy blanket in whatever quantity. Maybe it's just a square on a miter blanket. Maybe you use that entire leftover in a granny stripe blanket. Who knows? You eventually. But that is a really nice way to keep, if you're feeling like you have too many scraps, that can be a nice way to keep it at like an okay level. I really like to do that. I really like to use up my leftover bits of yarn in my scrappy blankets immediately. I don't always. Sometimes they go in my leftovers stash, but I really like to use them immediately because it's just, I'm still in love with that yarn, right? Most of the time, the yarn that you're knitting on is something you're in love with, so you get to carry out that little love affair just a little bit longer in a scrappy project. Some other ideas are maybe you dedicate a day a week, possibly Scrappy Sunday, possibly a different day. And it doesn't have to be the whole day. Maybe you work on your Scrappy project for an hour on Scrappy Sunday and make whatever progress you can make in that hour. Or maybe you just work on that project during a specific time of year because it's a long-term project and you don't need it done at any specific time. I know for me that my scrappy projects get a lot of work done at 2 different times of the year. One of them is summertime, and I host a knit along every summer called All the Small Things, where every small finish on a modular project or a scrappy project, scrappy blanket counts, or I'm not going to go into it other than that. So I get a lot of scrappy making done during the summertime. I pick my portable projects, I take them to the beach, I take them to the library, I take them wherever we're going, and I just go. And I've been doing that for several years now. So I know that's one time. And then the other time is during Advent season. A friend and I exchange Advent calendars, little yarny Advent calendars every year. And I know that I will at least make 1 square or something a day. It's almost never just 1. It's usually like 3 or 4 minis get touched during a day during December. So maybe that's your plan, to work on it, you know, just during the winter when you can have it on your lap. Figure out when you're going to work on your blanket so that you can schedule that in your brain. If you don't want to work on your scrappy blanket during summertime because it's too big, I totally get that. but leave yourself a little reminder somewhere that, hey, the temperatures are cooler. Let's pull out that Scrappy blanket and work on it a little bit. Question number 8, will you need border yarn? This is something to consider, especially if you're doing something with small pieces like the flower blanket that I'm making for my daughter. I want most of those flowers to be bordered in white. Some of them will be bordered in black though. When the flower is really too close to white to pop, then I'm going to use black, so it'll just be a sprinkling of little flowers with a black background. So I think that'll be really cool. For this blanket, let me hold up the other end that I'm not working on. I knew that I wanted to create blocks, and then I wanted to do sashing in between to attach those blocks. And I also knew I wanted to make a border around the edge that looked kind of like the binding on a quilt. So that's something I had to think about, and I had to consider what color yarn I wanted to use to border all of that. I went with gray because neutrals are your friends. I thought really hard about going with a green, but I decided gray would keep it from being too green for me to have in any sort of decor situation I might be in. Other things are, do you care if your border yarn is the same all the way around? I know some people who have done like Scrappy I-cord borders that are so good. They look so good around their blanket. But if you want a solid border, solid colored border, definitely keep that in mind. And decide where you're going to source that border. Are you going to buy your yarn for your border? If you are, that's okay. You can make a Scrappy blanket and still have to buy yarn for your border. I've bought all of the gray for the sashing and the border. You know, that was an expense that I knew going in I wanted to make, and I've been working on this blanket for a really long time. So the entertainment factor made the cost factor worth it. Another thing to consider is how much yarn you might need. And one way to figure that out is to look at how much yarn other people have needed for similar borders on their blankets. I didn't know anybody who had done this sashing thing on a blanket before, so I didn't have a jumping off point. I bought 2 skeins of the sashing color and actually needed a third. This is my 3rd skein right here. I'm on my very last bit of sashing, so this 3rd skein will get me through. And then I bought a slightly different gray for the border. I think this one gray will get me all the way through, but if not, I'll buy a second one. This is not a cheap blanket. It's okay. But you might want to consider that when starting your Scrappy blanket. Do you need a border? How much yarn will you need for that border? Are you going to make it scrappy or something specific? Question number 9. Now that you've figured out all of the other things, it's time to get a little technical. What do you need for your cast on or bind off or chain stitches? What do you need them to do for you? Are you going to want to do something provisional so that you can then pick up edging pieces later? Do you need something stretchy? If you're making a blanket and the edge doesn't have any stretch to it, if it's too stable, I'm sorry, my hair is staticky and now it's touching my face. Okay. Are we good? No, it says we're not good. I'll try to ignore it. If you are starting a blanket and the the start has no give to it, but your stitches are flexible, that can be quite jarring. On the other hand, if your stitches are super stretchy and you need them to not stretch all over the place, you might want a more structured beginning. Do you need to bind off in a way where your stitches are kind of just hanging there waiting for the next step, like similar to a provisional cast on, but at the end instead a provisional bind off? Is that a thing? I don't know. I know that there are ways that you can kind of bind off without actually binding off. So that directly relates mostly to what kind of border you want, how you want to finish your blanket. I'm sorry, my hair is still driving me crazy. So those are the 9 questions that I recommend you ask yourself before you start a Scrappy blanket, whether it's your first or your 20th. And these are all questions that I have come to through trial and error and mistakes and excitement and all sorts of things. If you enjoy this content, please leave me a comment below, hit the like button. If you have any questions, I would love to hear from you. I am usually pretty good about getting back to comments within about a week, barring like life stuff. Consider hitting the subscribe button if you would like to see more videos like this in the future, and definitely pass this video on if someone you know wants to start a Scrappy blanket. And if you're interested in Scrappy blankets, I have a sort of companion video to this coming out in about a week, so I hope to see you there too. All right, friends, I will talk to you later. Bye!